Welcome back to the deep dive. You sent us some really interesting sources, and today, we're honing in on one specific piece of research.
Yay.
It feels like it could genuinely shift how we think about learning. It's a study called Development and Validation of a Theory-Based Questionnaire to measure different types of cognitive load.
Yep, by Felix Krigelstein and several other researchers, came out January 2023.
And it all seems to hang on this thing called cognitive load theory, CLT.
Exactly, CLT, that's the foundation. And the core idea, really, is that learning works best when, the teaching methods actually line up with how our brains process information.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. Sounds simple enough on the surface, but what's the actual problem this research is trying to solve?
Well, the big challenge, the real puzzle, is figuring out how to accurately measure what's going on inside our heads when we learn, specifically the different kinds of mental effort.
Cognitive load.
Right, cognitive load. The study really tries to tackle that directly because if we understand how different learning activities, different materials affect our mental resources, well, that's key to designing better ways to teach and learn.
Gotcha. So our mission for this deep dive is pretty clear then. We're going to explore this research, break down these different types of cognitive load, see how they're measured,
Or how they try to measure them.
right? And hopefully pull out some insights for optimizing our own learning.
Precisely. These researchers basically saw that the existing ways to measure cognitive load had, well, limitations. So they decided to build and test a new questionnaire. From the ground up, really.
And the key things we'll be hitting are these three types of load they identify, how they actually built and checked their questionnaire across 5 studies, apparently.
Yeah, quite thorough.
And this ongoing debate around one specific type, germane cognitive load. Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us.
Definitely.
So let's start at the start. Cognitive load theory. What's the basic premise?
Okay, so basically CLT says that when we encounter information that's new and complex, it puts a strain on our working memory.
Working memory.
Mhm.
That's like the brain's RAM, right? The active bit.
That's a great analogy, yeah. It's your mental workspace where you hold and juggle information right now.
But it's limited.
Very limited, both in how much it can hold and for how long. We're talking maybe like 20 to 30 seconds for totally novel stuff.
Wow, that's short.
It is. It
Yeah.
sort of protects us from being completely swamped.
Makes sense. So if working memory is the scratch pad, what about long-term memory?
Ah, long-term memory. That's the vast library. Theoretically unlimited capacity. But crucially, it's not just a big data dump. It's organized
Organized how?
into structures called schemata, or schemas, you might know them as.
Okay, schemas,
Well,
mental frameworks.
Exactly. They're like cognitive blueprints. They bundle related bits of information together into a single unit, making them easier to handle.
Ah, so learning is about building these schemas.
Yes, building and automating them in long-term memory. Once you have a good schema for something, it acts like a single chunk, freeing up space in your working memory. That's how we get around those limitations.
Like knowing how to drive.
Yeah.
You don't think about every single step anymore.
Perfect example. It becomes automatic because the schema is so well developed. And this is the big difference between a novice and an expert in any field.
The expert just has way more relevant schemas built up.
Exactly. They can process complex information in their domain much more easily because it fits into their existing structures.
No, the paper mentioned an interesting extension. Something about evolutionary psychology. Biologically primary versus secondary information.
Right, that's a really useful distinction. Biologically, primary information is stuff we're basically evolved to learn effortlessly. Things essential for survival, social stuff.
Like recognizing faces.
Yeah.
Or learning to speak our first language.
Precisely, we just soak it up. Secondary information, though, that requires conscious effort. It's often culturally specific, needs explicit teaching. Think reading, writing, advanced math.
Stuff school focuses on.
Usually, yes. And that's the kind of learning that puts a heavy load on working memory. So CLT's recommendations are mostly aimed at making the acquisition of the secondary knowledge more efficient.
Okay, got it. That sets the stage nicely. So let's dive into the main event, the 3 types of cognitive load. First one is intrinsic cognitive load, ICL.
Right, ICL. This is all about the inherent difficulty of the material itself. It's the load imposed just by how complex the topic is.
And they talk about element interactivity. Sounds a bit jargony.
It does, but the idea is simple. It's about how many individual pieces of information or elements are involved in a task, and crucially, how much they interact with each other.
So low interactivity might be just memorizing a list of unrelated facts,
Exactly. Each fact is separate. High interactivity is when you have lots of elements and you have to understand how they all connect and influence each other simultaneously to make sense of the whole thing.
like understanding a complex system, maybe, where everything affects everything else.
Perfect. Think about understanding, say, climate change versus memorizing country capitals. Big difference in element interactivity.
Okay. Now, you mentioned schemas earlier. How do they relate to intrinsic load?
Well, this is key. Your prior knowledge, your existing schemas, can actually reduce the perceived intrinsic load.
How so?
If you already have some foundational schemas related to the topic, the new complex information doesn't seem quite as complex because you can integrate it into what you already know. It requires less juggling and working memory.
Right, because you're not starting from absolute zero.
Exactly.
So if you're designing instruction, you can't just magically make a complex topic simple if
Yeah.
that complexity is essential, right? So what can you do about intrinsic load?
Good question. You don't want to dumb it down if the complexity is the point, but you can help learners manage that load. One big strategy CLT talks about is the pre-training principle.
Pre-training, like a warm-up.
Sort of. It means introducing the key concepts, the basic definitions, the core components before you dive into the really complex interactions. Giving learners that foundation first makes the main task less intrinsically demanding when they get to it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So that's intrinsic load, the unavoidable complexity. What about the second type? Extraneous cognitive load, ECL.
I see. So this one is fundamentally different. It's the load created by things not directly related to the learning goal itself. It's mostly about how the information is presented.
So this is the bad load, the unnecessary stuff.
Pretty much. It's mental effort that doesn't actually help you build schemas. It just uses up precious working memory capacity. Think poor instructional design.
Like confusing instructions.
Yeah.
Or a really cluttered PowerPoint slide.
Absolutely. Or information scattered all over the place. Anything that forces your brain to do extra work that isn't actually about understanding the core content. The goal with ECL is basically to minimize it as much as possible.
Why? To free up resources.
Exactly. To free up working memory resources so they can be used to deal with the intrinsic complexity of the material.
Can you give a classic example of something that causes extraneous load?
The split attention effect is probably the most famous one. Imagine a diagram, maybe of the human heart, but all the labels are in a numbered list below the diagram.
Oh, I hate that. You're constantly looking back and forth trying to match the number to the part.
Precisely. Your working memory is strained, holding the label, searching the diagram, integrating the two. It's a huge amount of extraneous effort that doesn't help you learn about the heart itself.
So what's the fix for that?
Simple, really. Put the labels directly on the diagram. That's spatial contiguity, keeping related things close together physically. There's also temporal contiguity, presenting related things like audio narration and animation at the same time. It's all about reducing that unnecessary mental searching and integrating.
Makes total sense. Okay, intrinsic extraneous. Now the third one. Germane cognitive load, GCL. This one sounds
Oh,
different,
blast.
and the paper mentioned some debate around it.
Yeah, GCL is a bit more nuanced. It was added to the theory later on. It basically acknowledges that not all mental effort during learning is bad. Some effort is actually productive, essential for deep learning.
Productive effort. What does that mean?
It's the cognitive work involved in actively processing the information, connecting it to your existing knowledge, abstracting principles. Essentially, the effort that goes into building and automating those useful schemas in long-term memory.
So it's the effort of understanding and integrating, not just passively receiving.
Exactly. GCL is often described as having an allocation role. It's about directing your available working memory resources, hopefully freed up by reducing extraneous load, towards grappling with the intrinsic complexity in a meaningful way. This act of processing is sometimes called germane processing.
So the ideal scenario is minimize the bad load, ECL, which gives you more mental space to apply good, productive effort, GCL, to handle the necessary difficulty, ICL.
That's a really good summary, yes. And you can see why intrinsic and germane load are often seen as closely related. The effort you invest in understanding complex material, high ICL, is the germane load in action.
So instructors shouldn't try to eliminate all effort then? How do you actually foster germane load?
Right, you want to encourage it. One technique mentioned is the imagination principle.
Imagination.
Yeah, encouraging learners to actively form mental images or visualizations of the material. Say, if they're reading a text about how a mechanical system works, prompting them to picture it in their mind.
Why does that help?
Because it forces active processing. You're not just passively reading, you're translating the information into a different format, engaging with it more deeply. This links to ideas from generative learning theory. Actively generating your own representations promotes deeper learning.
Seeing with the mind's eye, as they put it.
Yeah.
Okay. But what's the controversy around GCL you mentioned?
The main issue, historically and ongoing, has been around defining it precisely, measuring it reliably, and how it fits theoretically. Because it's about internal mental processes, active schema construction, it's harder to pin down and isolate compared to load caused by task complexity or poor design. There's debate about whether it's a truly separate type of load or just reflects the effective allocation of resources towards dealing with intrinsic load.
Okay, so that leads perfectly into the measurement aspect.
Yeah.
If we want to optimize learning based on these loads, we need to measure them. But the paper calls reliable measurement the holy grail of CLT research. Why so difficult?
Well, cognitive load isn't something you can just, stick a thermometer in and measure directly. It's a latent construct. We can only infer it indirectly.
So what are the main ways researchers have tried to measure it?
Broadly, there are three approaches mentioned: dual task methods, physiological measures, and self-rating scales. This study we're diving into focuses mainly on self-ratings because they're the most common in educational research.
Let's quickly touch on the others, though. Dual task.
That involves having someone learn something, the primary task, while also doing a second, usually simple task like reacting to a light or sound. The idea is if the learning task is very demanding, performance on the secondary task will drop.
And physiological measures. Heart rate, brain scans.
Yeah, things like pupil dilation, heart rate variability, sometimes EEG or fMRI. Changes in these are thought to correlate with mental effort.
But these have downsides, right?
They do. Interpreting the drop in dual task performance isn't always straightforward, and physiological measures, while potentially objective, often need special equipment, can be intrusive, expensive, just not always practical for typical learning situations. Plus, a big limitation for both is that they generally give you an overall measure of load. They don't easily tell you what kind intrinsic, extraneous, or germane.
Okay, so that brings us to self-ratings. People just rating how much effort they felt.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Asking learners to reflect on their experience. And these come in two main flavors: unidimensional and multidimensional.
Unidimensional. Like one single rating.
Often, yes. The most famous is probably the PUTA scale, just a single 9-point item asking, how much mental effort did you invest in this task? Simple, easy to use.
But
it doesn't tell you why the effort was high or low. Was the topic complex? Was the presentation confusing? You don't know. Some researchers tried single items for specific load types too, but often with inconsistent wording or lacking solid validation.
So the move was towards multidimensional scales, trying to measure ICL, ECL, and GCL separately.
Exactly, using multiple questions, each designed to tap into one specific load type.
And the paper mentions a few existing ones.
Yeah.
Lepink et al.
Right. That was an early influential one. Had items for complexity, ICL, instruction clarity, ECL, and understanding, supposedly GCL. Showed some promise, but the GCL part was seen as a bit weak, maybe measuring outcome rather than process. They later adapted it, adding items about effort to cope.
Okay. Then there was Klepsch et al.
Yeah, that one had items like task complexity, elements to remember for ICL, linking info, task design clarity for ECL, and effort to understand context, understand correctly for GCL. An interesting finding with that one was that just telling learners briefly about CLT before they rated actually seemed to improve the validity of their ratings.
That's fascinating. Like knowing the concepts helps you reflect better.
Seems so. And then there's a more recent one by Donnes et al.
How did that one approach it?
Their items for ICL related to prior knowledge, strangeness of the topic. ECL was about clarity of language and instructions. But their GCL items were things like finding the task pleasurable or interesting.
That sounds more like motivation or emotion than cognitive processing effort.
That was exactly the concern raised by the authors of our current study. Those GCL items might not quite align with the core CLT definition of germane load as effortful schema construction.
So it sounds like all these previous multidimensional scales had issues, psychometric weaknesses.
Yeah, the paper points out several. Lepink's initial work didn't experimentally manipulate the different loads to really prove the scales could differentiate them. Donmez didn't use experimental manipulation either. Klepsch didn't report a key analysis called exploratory factor analysis, had few items per scale, and translation details were scarce. Donmez also used a mix of positive and negative wording, which can sometimes confuse people and affect reliability.
Okay, so the stage is set. There's a need for a better, more rigorously developed questionnaire. How did Kriegelstein and his team go about building theirs?
They followed standard scale development procedures pretty carefully. First step was a deep dive into the CLT literature foundational stuff, recent work to really nail down the theoretical definitions. Based on that, the authors collaboratively created an initial pool of 17 items.
What was their guiding philosophy when writing those items? How did they try to capture each load type?
The main goal was multiple items per load type, really trying to get at the core theoretical distinctions. For ICL, they focused on the learning content, its complexity, how many elements, interconnections, and importantly, they included an item specifically about prior knowledge, acknowledging its role.
And for ECL, extraneous load.
There, the focus was clearly on the design or structure of the learning material. They really wanted to separate that from the content's complexity.
That seems like a tricky distinction for learners to make sometimes.
It definitely can be. We'll see that pop up again later. They also made a specific linguistic choice.
Oh yeah, what was that?
They mostly used passive voice for ICL and ECL items. The content was complex, the design was confusing. The idea was these loads are sort of imposed on the learner. But for GCL items, they used first-person I statements. I tried hard to understand. I actively reflected.
To capture the active effort.
Exactly, the active investment of the learner. There was one exception, an ECL item about concentration also used I.
And how did they define and target GCL in their items, given the debates around it?
They really leaned into the germane processing idea. So items focused on mental effort directed at understanding, integrating, schema building. Things like reflecting on content, trying to understand connections, linking to prior knowledge, applying knowledge. They even tried to structure the items chronologically, sort of mirroring how learning might progress.
Okay, so they have these 17 items. What's the first test?
Study 1. They used principal component analysis, PCA. Got data from 69 university students learning about wastewater treatment. Sounds fun.
Right, PCA. Why that instead of, say, exploratory factor analysis?
Mainly due to the sample size being a bit small for EFA's assumptions. PCA is a bit more exploratory. They use specific techniques, oblique rotation, parallel analysis, to see how many underlying factors or components the items grouped onto.
And what did the PCA show?
It supported a 3-component structure aligning with ICL, ECL, and GCL. Based on how items loaded, how strongly they related to each component, and if they loaded on multiple ones, they decided to drop 2 of the GCL items.
Okay, so down to 15 items.
Yep.
Reran the PCA on those 15. Found satisfactory internal consistency for each component, meaning the items within each group seem to measure the same thing reasonably well. They also look at correlations.
Between the load types.
Yeah. In this initial analysis, ICL and ECL were positively correlated. But interestingly, both ICL and ECL were negatively correlated with GCL.
Okay. So PCA suggests 3 factors. What next?
Study 2. Time for confirmatory factor analysis, CFA. This is a stricter test where you specify the model beforehand here, their 3-factor model, and see how well the data fits it.
Bigger sample this time? Different topic.
Yep, 158 participants via Prolific. Learning about nerve cells, using materials designed to induce ECL a picture, and label separated spatially. Classic split attention setup.
And did the 3-factor model hold up in the CFA?
It provided an acceptable fit to the data, which is good news for their model. Factor loadings, how strongly items relate to their factor, were generally high for ICL and ECL items. A bit lower for the GCL items, though.
Lower for GCL. That echoes the challenges mentioned earlier. Potentially, yeah. Internal consistency for all 3 scales was still good to very good. They also checked convergent validity, how well their scale correlated with an existing one, the Klepsch questionnaire.
Yeah.
Found moderate convergence. Strongest correlation for ECL than ICL, weakest for GCL. Again, GCL seems a bit distinct or harder to capture consistently.
Okay, so the statistical analyses look promising, if maybe a little weaker for GCL. But the real test is, does it work in practice? Can it detect changes when you actually manipulate the learning conditions?
Exactly. That's what the next 3 studies were all about, experimental validation. Seeing if the questionnaire was sensitive to manipulations designed to increase or decrease specific types of load.
Same basic setup for these 3 studies.
Pretty much. Online experiments, screen sharing, no notes allowed. Participants gave consent, did a prior knowledge check, were randomly assigned to a condition, experimental or control, saw the learning material, filled out the new 15-item cognitive load questionnaire, took a learning test, and provided demographic info.
Okay, let's take them one by one. Study 3. Varying intrinsic cognitive load. How?
They used that pre-training principle. Topic was pulley systems. The experimental group got pre-training on basic pulley concepts before tackling the main, more complex material. The control group just got the main material, idea. Pre-training should lower the ICL of the main task.
Did it work? Did the questionnaire pick it up?
Yes, the pre-trained group reported significantly lower ICL, just as expected, but they also reported higher GCL.
Higher germane load. That's interesting. Like freeing up resources from ICL allowed more GCL.
That's one interpretation. Yeah, it supports that interplay idea. Interestingly, though, there was no significant difference in their actual scores on the learning test between the groups.
Okay. Lower ICL, higher GCL, but same performance. Complex. What about study 4, varying extraneous load?
Here, they used the split attention effect, learning about cellular respiration. One group got integrated text and diagrams. The other group got them spatially separated, designed to increase ECL.
And did the questionnaire show higher ECL for the separated group?
It did, yes. Significantly higher ECL, as predicted.
Yeah.
But they also reported higher ICL.
Higher intrinsic load, too, just from separating text and images.
Apparently so. It suggests that poor presentation might make the content itself feel more complex or harder to process for learners. That group also performed worse on the learning test. No difference in GCL reported between the groups this time.
So bad design, high ECL, hurts learning and might even make the topic seem harder. Higher ICL. Makes sense. Okay, finally, study 5. Varying germane load. How they target that?
With the imagination principle, learning about the human respiratory system from text. The experimental group was explicitly instructed to try and form mental images as they read. The control group just read normally. Idea. Imagery instruction should boost GCL.
And the results.
Pretty clear-cut this time. The imagery group reported significantly higher GCL, exactly as hypothesized. And importantly, they also performed significantly better on the learning tests.
So higher GCL linked to better learning outcomes here.
Yes. And there were no significant differences in reported ICL or ECL between the groups in this study. So the manipulation seemed to target GCL effectively.
That's quite compelling. It really supports the idea that actively engaging, doing that germane processing, helps. And all this work culminates in the final 15-item questionnaire presented in the paper.
Exactly. Through these 5 studies, PCA, CFA, and the 3 experiments, they built a solid case for the reliability and validity of this new tool, at least in these contexts.
All right, let's wrap our heads around the big picture then, the general discussion, the key takeaways from all this research.
Right.
What did the authors emphasize most?
Well, the main achievement is clearly the questionnaire itself, developing and validating this multi-item tool for ICL, ECL, and GCL. The stats, PCA, and CFA largely supported the 3-factor structure.
And the experiments.
The experiments showed it was sensitive, it could pick up differences when they deliberately manipulated the load types. That's crucial validation.
They mentioned something about the GCL factor loadings having reversed signs in the PCA. What was that about?
Oh, right. That was just a technical point confirming that higher agreement with their GCL items did mean higher germane load, which is how you'd want it to work for interpretation. They also noted, logically, that while each scale, ICL, ECL, GCL, had decent internal consistency, the overall reliability across all 15 items was lower because they were measuring different things.
Makes sense. And they acknowledged the slightly weaker findings for GCL and the CFA, the lower factor loadings.
Yes, they did, which, again, might reflect the inherent difficulty in measuring this more internal process-oriented type of load. The correlations they found between the load types also reinforce that these aren't totally separate buckets.
Right, they interact. Like ECL can eat up resources needed for GCL to tackle ICL.
Exactly. They also mentioned something called method variance, just the fact that using the same method, a questionnaire to measure related things, can sometimes inflate correlations a bit. It's a common thing in this type of research.
What about the experimental results? Any nuances there?
Study 3, the pre-training one, really highlighted that complex ICL-GCL link. Study 4, the split attention one, showed how hard it can be for learners to disentangle difficulty caused by content, ICL, versus presentation, ECL. But Study 5, the imagination one, was quite strong support for the GCL manipulation improving learning.
And did the overall correlations between prior knowledge, load types, and learning performance generally fit with CLT?
Mostly, yes. More prior knowledge usually meant lower reported ICL. Higher ICL and ECL generally linked to poorer learning, higher GCL linked to better learning, especially in Study 5. But yeah, that persistent difficulty learners seem to have telling ICL and ECL apart showed up in some correlations too. They even speculated that motivation might sometimes explain weird negative correlations between ICL and GCL.
So summing up the questionnaire itself, what are its main strengths, according to the authors?
They highlight the transparent development process, the grounding in theory making it potentially applicable across different media, its ability to differentiate load sources to understand why learning might be difficult, the experimental verification showing it's sensitive, and testing it under fairly realistic online learning conditions.
Sounds pretty good. What about the limitations? They must have acknowledged some.
Oh, definitely. Key ones are only the German version is fully validated so far. The GCL scale, while sensitive in Study 5, did show slightly weaker psychometric properties overall. Relying on self-report always brings in factors like how aware people are of their own thinking, their metacognition, and that recurring issue of learners sometimes mixing up intrinsic and extraneous load.
And they circle back to the GCL definition challenge, right?
Yeah. Yes. Emphasizing that how best to define and measure GCL is still an active discussion. They position their GCL items as measuring germane processing, that active effort towards understanding the core material. Their bottom line is, it's a useful tool for researchers, especially in experiments, but interpret the GCL part with a little caution, and more research on GCL itself is needed.
Okay, wow. That was definitely a deep dive. So bringing it back to our listeners, what are the absolute key takeaways here?
I think the main thing is understanding these three flavors of mental effort: intrinsic load from the stuff itself, extraneous load from how it's presented, and germane load from your active processing. They all impact learning. And measuring them properly is tricky but vital, as this study shows with their new questionnaire.
And practically speaking, for someone learning or someone teaching.
Understanding this helps you diagnose difficulties. Is this hard because it's just complex, ICL? Or is it explained badly, ECL? Am I actively engaging with it, GCL? For educators, it's about managing ICL, like pre-training, ruthlessly cutting ECL, clear design, and actively encouraging GCL, like using imagery or other engaging techniques. Small changes based on these ideas can make a big difference.
So a final thought for everyone listening, thinking about these different load types, what's one thing you might change in how you learn or how you teach or present information based on this? Definitely food for thought.
Absolutely. And if this sparked your interest, digging more into cognitive load theory itself, or even looking up this specific questionnaire by Kriegelstein and colleagues, could be really rewarding. It's a field with huge implications for making learning better for everyone.
Great stuff. Thanks so much for breaking that all down. And thank you all for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning.